The standing straight arm raise is an active test that assesses whether the arms can be brought overhead without compromising the shoulders or spine, as well as providing an indication of a client's ideal grip width. Whereas the supine straight arm raise looks at someone's structural limitations, this test looks at how much of that potential they're using and what faults they commit in the process. That knowledge will help us identify someone's capacity for movements like the pull up, overhead press, and overhead squat, and whether those movements need to be modified to suit the individual. During the standing straight arm raise, we'll be looking to answer 4 questions. Can the arms be brought overhead without internal rotation of the humerus or flexing of the elbow? Does the spine remain neutral? How wide does the humerus need to be to get overhead without compromise? And lastly, is there any pain? To perform this test, you'll need a flat wall that's tall enough for the arms to go overhead, and you'll need enough space for you to move around the client. Let's have a look at the test. Joe's going to stand with his back to the wall. His feet are under his hips, his knees extended, and he's maintaining 3 points of contact with the wall: the head, the shoulders, and the butt. This position provides me with a visual reference and Joe with a kinesthetic reference for a neutral spine and stacking the bones correctly. Before we go any further though, I'm going to pull Joe's clothing taut so my view isn't obstructed, and I'm going to visually inspect the space between the wall and his lumbar. I'm also going to have a look at his sternum. Just like the supine straight arm raise, all of this gives me a reference point for change during the test. From there, I'm going to have a look at his arm position. The arm should hang alongside the body, his elbow extended and pointing laterally, his palms flat and his fingers extended. Now we're ready to begin the test. Joe's going to bring his arm forward in an arc until the arms are overhead and the back of his hand touches the wall, or as close to that position as he can get. Because there's a few different things happening at once here, it helps to simplify things by answering 1 question per repetition. On the first rep, I'm looking at whether Joe can get his arm into the overhead position. As he's moving, I'm watching the elbow to ensure the humerus isn't internally rotated and that the elbow remains extended. Both of those faults can be used to cheat a narrower overhead position, but they also diminish power and rob the shoulder of stability. If you see the elbow turn to face the wall, it indicates internal rotation. Rotation of the hand can indicate rotation of the humerus, but it's not foolproof, as the hand can rotate independently. So if in doubt, watch the elbow. If Joe gets to the overhead position without compromising the arm, I'll get him to repeat the movement while I watch his torso. I'm looking for any lost points of contact, extension of the spine, and lifting of the sternum. Any of those 3 faults indicate a loss of the neutral spine position he started with. And while he might be able to get away with them in a static movement like the overhead press, more complex and dynamic movements like the overhead squat, push press, and push jerk will suffer. If Joe's made it this far, the last point to look at is the angle of his arm. That angle is recorded in the screening performer as 0 degrees, 45 degrees, more than 45 degrees, or somewhere in between. That angle translates to grip width in overhead movements. If it's the same as the width from the supine straight arm raise, it's likely the most narrow grip he's capable of, period. Now, it's not uncommon to find that one arm requires a wider grip than the other. In those cases, use the widest position as your reference for grip width when conducting overhead work. So far, we've assumed that Joe nailed everything the first time. But what if he committed a fault? How we proceed depends on what fault or faults he committed. If the arm couldn't get overhead and he didn't internally rotate the humerus, bend his elbow, or lose his neutral spine, I'd get him to try wider positions with the arm until it was able to get all the way overhead. If Joe did compromise the humerus or the elbow, I'd have him repeat the overhead movement until he committed the fault. Then I'd stop him, get him to fix the fault, and continue overhead. But if he still can't get overhead without compromise, it's time to work the arm wider until he can get overhead without committing a fault. If Joe loses his neutral spine position, how he loses it is important. Did he lift up the ribs and sternum, or did he lose a point of contact with the wall? If he lifted the ribs, I'd remind him of the hollow test we conducted earlier. I want him to use that same technique to keep his ribs locked down as he moves the arm overhead. If he lost a point of contact, I'd get him to repeat the movement while focusing on keeping those points of contact with the wall. If he can sort out the neutral spine fault but still can't get the arm overhead, it's time for him to try wider arm positions until it gets there. Lastly, I'll ask Joe whether he experienced any pain during the movement, then repeat the process on the other arm. Before we move on, Here's a few key points to keep in mind during the standing straight arm raise. First, the client's doing all the work, so before you start testing them, they'll need a demonstration of the movement. Once you've demonstrated the movement, coach them through it a couple of times. Second, make sure those 3 points of contact with the wall are maintained: the head, the shoulders, and the butt. Lastly, keep things simple by answering one question per repetition. The data you've collected in this test can be compared to the supine straight arm raise, the squats test, and the scapular function test. The supine straight arm raise shows you a client's narrowest possible grip for overhead work, and the standing version looks at how much of that potential they're using. If the standing version falls short of the supine version, the problem isn't that they can't get there, but they don't know how. That's where the scapular function test comes in. It can be used to identify a motor fault that compromises stability of the shoulder and limits overhead range. For the squats test, you're looking at the front squat and overhead squat. For the front squat, you're looking for loss of the neutral spine position as active demands on the shoulders increase. For the overhead squat, you're looking for the same fault as well as those seen in this test: bending the elbow and internal rotation of the humerus. This can be caused by exceeding the passive limitations identified in the supine straight arm raise, though it can also be due to the same motor fault I mentioned earlier, which is identified by the scapular function test. If you were able to fix spinal extension by closing down the rib cage, then this test provides coaches with a kinesthetic reference for doing the same thing in the overhead press and the overhead squat. To sum up, the standing straight arm raise is an active test that assesses whether the arms can be brought overhead without compromising the shoulders or spine, as well as providing an indication of a client's ideal grip width. Whereas the supine straight arm raise looks at someone's structural limitations, this test looks at how much of that potential they're using and what faults they commit in the process. That knowledge will help us identify someone's capacity for movements like the pull-up, overhead press, and overhead squat, and whether those movements need to be modified to suit the individual.